Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Indies Introduced series, where we spotlight debut authors handpicked by booksellers from around the country. In each episode, a bookseller from the Indies Introduced panel will interview the author of a debut title featured in our program.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Pope from Prologue Bookshop, located in Columbus, Ohio, and I am here with Gloria Huang to talk about Kaya of the Ocean. So Gloria L. Huang is an author of middle grade novels. Her short stories have been published in literary journals, including the Southern Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, the Three Penny Review, and Chicago Quarterly Review and Witness Magazine, among others. She holds a degree in English literature from Stanford University. She is represented by Transatlantic Agency, and her debut novel, Kaya of the Ocean, will be released on January 7th, 2025. Hi, Gloria. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So I kind of want to kick things off with just knowing a little bit about the inspiration behind Kaya of the Ocean.
For sure. So I think there were two sources of inspiration, really. The first one was that in recent years, I, along with many other people, I'm sure, witnessed a lot of people, but especially children, and for me personally, a lot of children close to me, having to struggle with higher levels of anxiety. And I feel like children have the tendency to internalize anxiety as something that's wrong with them, since it's often the first time they've encountered it. So I wanted to write a book that showed them that there's power in accepting all parts of who they are, even their imperfections. And then the second inspiration was that I wanted to tell this specific story by weaving in threads from my cultural history. So when you read it, you'll see that there are, well, I don't know if you'll see, but there are Easter eggs, especially in the flashbacks, that were kind of loosely inspired by events that happened in my family's history. I also wanted to center Mazu, who's this fascinating Chinese water goddess. And I've always been intrigued by her because she's this really strong female figure that rose to deification and worship before it was really common for strong female figures to exist in that space. She's still worshipped to this day, but I haven't seen that much written about her, especially in the fictional middle grade sphere. So I kind of wanted to incorporate her as well.
Okay, I'm glad that you brought up the flashbacks and maybe that referencing your family history. I definitely want to hop into that. But first, in regards to your first point, in terms of creating a character that is dealing with serious anxiety, in terms of like middle grade fiction and just the children's genre in general, it seems like authors are leaning really heavily into discussing real issues that young children are facing. How did you kind of balance that, creating that for middle grade audiences without making it like too much or too heavy?
No, that's a really good question. And to your other point too, I did want to mention that I think I have also noticed there's kind of an increase in discussing these kind of serious topics like anxiety experienced by children. And I am really glad to see it because I think it's important for children who are dealing with this to be able to see these characters, that they grow and love going through something similar. But to your question about how to balance, I think for me, it was important to kind of stay true to the experience of dealing with anxiety. And I do want to mention here that while I do deal with like a certain level of anxiety, as I imagine many people do, what Kaya experiences is more what I've seen people very close to me deal with. And I wanted to kind of respect and honor that authentically in my story. And I think part of dealing with anxiety is that it's not an all or nothing experience, that you have these moments of extreme anxiety, but there are also these moments of calm and these moments of levity. And I actually think that this back and forth can be kind of terrifying for people, but especially for a young child. So part of my mission was to create an accurate and true and genuine portrait of all the facets of Kaya's experience. So, you have anxiety sometimes dominating, but it doesn't eclipse the levity and joy that her friends bring, and it doesn't erase this complicated love that exists between her and her parents.
I think you can definitely feel that in the book. Like there were so many great moments, like
Oh,
with
thank you.
they're like laughing, and you can tell that there is like a ton of love that goes into um this character in this story. So when you were creating Kaya, um, in reference to like your family history, what kind of research did you kind of have to do? Did you have to have some conversations to find out ways to insert that past into this story?
Yes, some of it, research, I think, makes it sound a bit more scholarly than maybe it really was. I think my father has, ever since I was little, told me stories about kind of our family history, and sometimes it's like happened to someone that a couple times removed. So the flashback with Shan Yu, where they're escaping on the boat, that actually happened to a neighbor of my father's family, and it was almost his sister that was going to be on that boat, and so that was kind of the inspiration. Inspiration sounds like a horrible word because it was clearly a tragedy, but that was the source from where that story came about. And then some of the other pieces, so for example, during the gold rush, that I did more research into, and then also kind of fishing villages and just keeping true to that time. I wanted to make sure that I was as accurate as possible. I don't claim to be a historical fiction specialist, but I did want it to be whatever I had to be accurate, to be as genuine as possible.
So in terms of Kaya of the Ocean being your debut novel, is this what you imagined your first book would be?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and it's also kind of a difficult one, because I think that as authors, we all kind of fall in love with the current book that we're creating, and we all imagine introducing it to the world so that other people can fall in love with these characters that we're spending so much time with. So to that point, yes, I would definitely say that Kaya is, I love this phrase that I see so much, but the book of my heart. And I definitely imagined it being my first novel. But I've also been writing novels, and I'm putting air quotes there, since I was a child, because some of those early novels were were a whole other thing. But I also probably imagined every single one of them as debuts too. Um, that being said, it's been an amazing journey, and it's both what I imagined, but also more in a lot of ways.
Why do you think that this one kind of made it to this final form?
I think it's a couple things, and I think one of which is that, as you talked about, there's kind of more of an emphasis on focusing on these things that children experience, like anxiety. And I think it's becoming more normalized to talk about it, which I just think is so important. So I think that maybe the fact that I had seen, and people very close to me and children very close to me go through this, maybe lent it a bit of authenticity that was recognized. That's what I hope, anyways. I also think that there is, this might be wishful thinking, but I think that there is more of an appetite in a lot of ways for different cultural contexts. And so I really wanted to share that part of my familial and cultural history. And hopefully that was also something that was attractive, that, people picked up on and was like, this is really interesting. I want to include this voice. I want this voice in the canon. That's what I hope, anyways.
I definitely think so. It's Kaya as a character, you see like so many different elements with her family, and conversations that are happening in the book, whether that's like about tourism on the island, assimilation, Kaya just as a complex character dealing with anxiety, also being like this like reader who kind of is very much so in like her own space. Um, what can you kind of like imagine in terms of like the reader that will pick up this book?
That's a great question. So I think I always try and keep my readers in mind when I'm writing. I'm half in the character's head and then half in my reader's head, and I think part of Kaya is kind of an amalgamation of so many things, people, children that inspired me, parts of myself, I think, but also how I imagine readers to be. And so for readers who might be reading it, who might be going through something similar with either with anxiety or something else, um, I really hope that they read it and they see themselves reflected back a little, and they see that they're not alone, that other people go through this. And I hope they take away the message that all the parts of who they are, all the strengths and the flaws are what makes them powerful. That accepting all those parts should be the goal and not hiding or changing themselves like Kaya initially tries to. And there's a line that's spoken by Kaya's dad in the book, 确认美. It's a Chinese expression that my grandfather actually used to say a lot. And it basically means that things are more beautiful when they're imperfect or flawed. And I kind of hope they remember that. I hope that that's the takeaway.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. There actually was one line I screenshotted it and I was like, okay, I definitely need to bring this up. It was actually towards the beginning. Kai was having a conversation. She said I asked my mom why I didn't have blonde hair and blue eyes like so many of the girls in my books. My mom replied distractedly, doesn't matter, work hard, be successful, then write your own books with Chinese girls in them. Was that kind of like your own voice poking through maybe?
You are 1,000% correct. That was really my own voice. And it was also, I wanted to kind of honor what I think children of Asian immigrant parents often kind of hear, especially if they're going into more artistic sphere or if they're having those kind of thoughts. There's kind of a tendency to be like, doesn't matter, like focus on the end goal. And so I think that a lot of Kaya's mom's love comes out kind of like that, which is very true for kind of Asian immigrant parents. But the heart of what she was saying, I think, was kind of a message to like my former self and maybe, any other child out there who needs to hear that, who is like, I want to see more people like me. And there's a part of me that's like, you can create that.
Hmm. So when you were growing up in terms of like the literature that you were reading,
Mhm.
what were the books that kind of inspired you, maybe that might have lent their voice to yourself as a writer now, but just that inspired you in the past?
Yeah, this is a great question. It is going to maybe age me a little, but some of my favorite books that I can think of that really made a difference. So Tuck Everlasting is a book I loved. And The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle was another great book. That one was actually really meaningful because there wasn't a lot of books out there where it's centered like a, a young girl as the protagonist in an adventure. So that was really exciting for me. But I also liked books like Little Women, which were, I think, even back then kind of um, both of the past, but also a little bit ahead of their time because they were centering these stories about these women who were doing what they could with what they had. Um, Kind of on the more commercial side, I was an avid consumer of the Babysitters Club, which I actually think is back in style now in graphic novel form, which I think is really cool. But one of the characters in the Babysitters Club is named Claudia Kishi, and she was mind-blowingly ahead of her time. She was this Japanese American character who was artistic and fashionable and not at all bookish. And there really wasn't anyone else out there who looked or acted like her at that time in middle grade literature. So I actually think that you'll find a lot of Asian Americans who grew up with Babysitters Club were big fans of hers. Um, oh, I also read the Sweet Valley Twins series, and I loved them at the time, but they're kind of now, I think, an example of books in which I couldn't find anyone who was like me, and I think they're kind of an example of why diverse voices are important. It's when I think back on it, it's a little surprising because they were set in Southern California, but there wasn't a lot of diversity in them. Um, so I don't know. I think that even back then there was like this need for diverse voices, and I kind of hope it continues just getting more and more diverse so people can see themselves reflected.
Hmm. So what do you hope for like the future in terms of what you're seeing currently in middle grade literature? Where do you think that that writing has the power to go, especially for an audience like middle grade students?
Yeah, yeah. That's a really good question. So I think that I kind of touched on it a couple times. I really hope that the future of middle grade fiction will continue kind of including more diverse voices and stories. And I hope that the wider audience stays open to these stories and voices, even if they might not feel familiar at first, but they have something important to say. Um, I feel like middle grade fiction is this super important genre that sometimes maybe people don't realize the importance that they can take in someone's life, but they're really read by children at this point in their lives where they're experiencing extreme change, and I think it can be exciting, it can be unsettling, it can be scary. It's an upheaval. So I think a lot of children turn to books for comfort, which is what I did as a child, and I think that it can be painful if you look for yourself and don't see yourself reflected back. So I guess I hope, and this is a little long-winded way of saying that, I hope that middle grade literature continues to welcome kind of different voices, and it both allows children to see who they are reflected in these stories, but it also shares these different experiences with other children at a time when they're really impressionable. And then we can see all the differences, but we can also see kind of the shared commonalities. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely does. I always tell my friends and like readers that come into the bookstore that middle grade literature is like some of my favorite at the moment. I feel like it's definitely on like the cutting edge of things, and the writing is always absolutely amazing.
Great.
Especially in that like fantasy space, the all of those books.
Yeah.
I know that this is like always a very difficult question for authors, but in terms of what you're currently reading, what have you been picking up? What has been piquing your interest in terms of literature?
Oh, so no, I actually love talking about that because I am a kind of voracious reader. I think that was that, not to keep going back to the middle grade fiction, but I think that another important thing is that it is the gateway for so many children into these different worlds, but also into the love of like reading and writing and kind of art and creation. So I try and read kind of a variety of things. As you mentioned, I write adult literary short stories. So I will read, adult fiction. For adult fiction, I usually do kind of more literary stories. And then I try and read some young adult and middle grade as well, just middle grade, obviously, because it's what I write in, and I want to keep my voice as fresh as possible. Young adult, because I want to have nuances in my voice and be able to kind of pull in all those influences. There's so much great middle grade fiction out right now. It's really such a great time for middle grade books. And there's this one book that I read not super recently, but it has just really stayed with me. It had such an impact on me. It's called When You Trap a Tiger by Tay Keller. And it's just this beautiful and haunting depiction of grief and the complicated love between generations of a family, the daughter and mother and grandmother. And it's couched in this really intricate and nuanced cultural context. It's just so great. It's beautiful. I love it. I think for young adult, I tend a little bit more towards dystopic, but just to kind of get that in there, it's also kind of an area that I enjoy consuming. And then I think for adults, recently I read Yellowface, which I think was a really, really interesting satirical take on kind of the publishing industry. So all those pieces out there.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, like Yellowface, that book, that was a wild ride.
It really was.
So in terms of like your editing process,
Mm-hmm.
was there anything that you had to take out of the book that you like might have struggled with?
Yeah,
Or
no, that is such a good question, and I have an answer ready for it, which is that I actually had to revise a few times the character of Kaya's mom, and I think that anyone who has an Asian American immigrant mother will probably know this, but a lot of times they will kind of toe the line between strict and loving. And in the earlier versions, a couple of my beta readers were like, she seems a little mean. I think that she seems a little bit like overly tough. And so I really needed to soften her edges to make sure that her love for Kaya could shine through, that I was like, I don't want that to obscure anything. So that was something that definitely got revised in the editorial process.
Okay. Yeah, I like Kaya's mother.
Good. I'm glad.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
So in terms of what you're currently working on, you've got this, your debut is complete. It's all set to be released in January. What is next?
That's yeah. So for me, I'm one of those people who are always writing my next project. Like I can't exist without working on something, and I'm happiest if I have a couple of projects in the pipeline. So I finished, I think, and part of my process is that once I finish something, I usually step away for a little bit and just like kind of refill the creative well, as they say, and try and read books and watch films or shows, and hopefully in kind of the genre I'm writing in. But then I go back to it, and I'm working on a couple of things. But short stories for me are always a really good way to kind of jump into a project. A lot of my short stories actually will become like seeds from which novels later grow. But I that's a good way for me to kind of almost brainstorm. I start with the short stories, and then a lot of them I'm like, this could be a book.
Okay, so we have a short story collection maybe to look forward to.
Yeah, that would be great. I would love that.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad we had a chance to have this conversation. Kaya of the Ocean is a super, super inspiring book. I absolutely loved it. I felt in love with like all of the elements of this book. So I'm looking forward to it being released on January 7th. Is there anything else that you want to tell readers about Kaya of the Ocean as we're like preparing for its release?
I guess just that thank you to everybody who has pre-ordered. I know that people have pinged me to say that they have, anyone who's supported in any way, but also anyone who goes and reads and spends some time with Kaya and her friends. Thank you for doing that. And I hope it's meaningful. I hope that the experience that Kaya goes through is uplifting and helpful, even just a little bit for you.
Well, Kaya of the Ocean is going to be released on January 7th, 2025. By the time you're listening to it, the book should be out. This was a great conversation with Gloria Huang, and thank you for listening.
Thanks so much. This is so much fun.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the Bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!